My name is Peter Shanley, and my family were drapers in Westport for 4 generations. And my grandfather came here from County Leitrim via Turbacurry in County Sligo, where he trained as a young man from 14 years of age, and he went on to become manager of an existing department store in that area, a family called Cook's. And he had the opportunity to come to Westport in 1908, where he bought an existing business, drapery business, a department store, which was owned and managed by a family called Parsons. The family Parsons moved to Belfast, where they inherited a business. He bought the business in Westport, and it became Shanley Brothers, he and his brother Charlie. And his brother Charlie opened a drapery business in Ballinack, and that was part of the Shanley Brothers shops. My grandfather married a young woman whose brother had a drapery business in Castlebar called Pat Langan. And it is now his business outlet was where Heaton's shop are now based, on the main street there in Castlebar. So effectively the family had 3 major drapery outlets in Mayo at the time. My granduncle, who ran the business of Ballina, died. My grandfather had to sell the business in 1922 because it was impossible to manage it during the Civil War. And then he jointly ran the business in Westport with his brother-in-law in Castlebar, Pat Langan. And subsequently, my father went on to inherit the business, and my mother, who came to Westport as an employee of the Bank of Ireland during the war years in 1942, and married my father, she ended up managing the business because my father, unfortunately, was not interested, and he developed, unfortunately, a passion for drink. And as a result, the business was managed very effectively by my mother. My grandfather, who took over that business, who bought the business from Parsons, was an extremely far-seeing and shrewd and clever businessman. And in the 1920s, he had the business entirely renovated in one building. He bought the building next door and he demolished it and rebuilt it entirely. And he brought in all the shop fittings from London, which were manufactured by a company called Pollard, and they were all manufactured of oak and mahogany. The place was mahogany, glass and brass. So it was quite a very imposing and a very, very form of Harrods in the west of Ireland. It was known as the Harrods of the west of Ireland, and probably was too ambitious really for the population that existed here at the time, but that's the way it was. And
what time would that be around? What years?
About 1926 he
26.
started that, yeah. And again in 1930s he finished the programme of modernisation. And at that stage he, as a man himself, would have been in his early 60s. So it was quite something.
But it was very successful, was it?
It was incredibly successful because I think what one must get back to is drapery as we know it today was not the drapery as it was then. It was a totally different type of business. Drapery was the most lucrative form of retailing then. Today it's supermarkets, then it was drapery. And people had to, they had to dress properly in order to live, to survive the weather. And there were no cars. So you presented yourself through your apparel. As Shakespeare said, the apparel doth proclaim the man. And so drapery was a way in which people projected and portrayed themselves. And only the draper could sell drapery. People only went to a drapery shop for drapery. They went to a hardware shop for hardware, and they went to a grocer for groceries. And everything had its place. And so you went to a chemist shop, you bought your drugs there. So there was no crossover, everything was specialised. And so the drapery for people, they had to buy heavy underwear for the winter. The type of suit one wore declared one's status in society, and people dressed. And the men always, working men, would always put on a good suit on Sunday, as they said, their Sunday going to Mass suit. If a farmer came to town, he always wore his suit, his hat and his overcoat. And secondly, people were exposed to the elements. To travel, one had to sit on a sidecar, a horse and cart, a pony or a bicycle, and one might have to travel 3 miles, 10 miles or 30 miles, but one had to do it in the rain, the wind and the cold. And working outdoors, one had to be properly dressed, or one died from exposure, from the cold, from the wet. And so one had to have, from the skin out, heavy underwear, heavy clothing, warm, effective and dry. And so clothing was effectively a form of central heating. It was a substitute for the car in that it protected you from the elements. And so drapery was a very lucrative and a very profitable business to be in. Alas, it has changed entirely today, where clothes have taken a totally different role. And so to understand drapery, one has to understand the place it took in society and the part it played in people's lives at the time. And so for my grandfather, he got involved in the most lucrative and the most rewarding retail business that there was. It was also, if you like, it had the highest standing socially in the retail business, the retail world. If you could take a Harrods, everybody aspired to be a Harrods or a Selfridge. And you had the Brown Thomases, and you had the Switzers in Dublin, and you had Shanleys in Westport. And that's how it was. And he developed...
Oh, I've heard that, yeah. Famous.
It's very, very famous for the fittings, the layout, the staff. And at the time, what also was important to remember is that there was no such thing then as self-help or self-selection or going in and picking something off a shelf. One had to be served by somebody. If you went to the grocer, you had to order a loaf of bread and it was handed to you across the counter, or a tin of beans. In drapery, if you even wanted to buy a handkerchief, you had to ask a member of the staff to buy a handkerchief, whether it was for a lady or a man. And so there was a very high staffing level in the shop, or in shops in those days, and you had a huge apprenticeship system. We didn't have the educational system. What we had at the time was a huge apprenticeship system, and it was applied to drapery, hardware, it applied to carpentry, it applied to building, it applied to every form of business and commerce in the country and activity. And very, very few people went on to third level education, apart from basically those who went into teaching or into medicine, as simple as that. Businessmen in those days, none of the businessmen in those days ever had a proper education as we know it today. They were men who were trained, having left school at 14, and were apprenticed or articled to another businessman. And they in turn worked their way up through the ranks, and at 17 or 18 years of age would be given their papers, or if you like, their qualifications. And they in turn would move on, and they would have to leave the place in which they were trained.
At times did they have to pay to go into places?
My grandfather would have had to be paid in early years by the sons, by the fathers of the sons and daughters of the people who were apprenticed to us. What they were doing effectively was they were paying for their children's education. It was effectively another form of education.
Kind of a
they were
level.
guaranteed a job at the end of the day, and a guaranteed a place in society and a job, and it was secure, and it was a lifetime. And also another thing was that there was a huge turnover in staff, because once a young woman got married, she had to leave her place of employment.
Had to.
There was no question. Once she got married, she had to leave. And obviously the men stayed, some stayed, and then others just moved on. They moved to the cities, they emigrated, or they went on to become commercial reps on the road. And as a result, we would have had employed in our premises at the time probably 18 to 20 people at a time. And in the very, very early years, the turn of the century, we would have had people who actually lived on the premises and worked on the premises as young people. And so that's where my grandfather would have had to be paid to maintain and look after them and educate them. So life was, I think, to understand what it was like then, it was completely different than anything we can even imagine today. It was Dickensian, it was Victorian, right up into the Second World War. And it was a very personal business. And the second thing about it was, which is people don't realise today, is that probably 80% of our business on a daily basis was done on a credit basis. Very little money across the counter. Everything was done on credit. Virtually everything during the day. And people paid on a seasonal basis whatever they owed in the company. And we would have had a full-time staff in the office maintaining the books. So we supplied the goods and we gave the credit. And
did you have many defaulters?
I have a book of bad debts to this day, which would cause, if I was to reveal the names, many a blushing face in this area. But it's still
not on the record yet.
It is not on public record, no. But of course we had defaulters, and there were genuine defaulters. And people there simply wasn't the money in circulation. And there was a lot of hardship. And my grandfather always wrote off a certain number of debt owed by people every year, by people who really were in bad circumstances.
And would they come back again? Would you take them?
Always. The people who couldn't pay, he said they'll always pay. They'll pay one day. That was his attitude. And
they did not bankrupt him?
No. He was able to fortunately manage on the basis that he worked on the basis that he was going to have so many bad debts anyway. And he also was able to and as did every draper, work on the basis that their stock didn't have a shelf life. So nothing really dated. So what you bought in today, if you didn't sell tomorrow, you could sell it next year. It didn't have a date.
Fashions didn't change much.
Fashions changed very little. And the critical thing was to stay warm and look prosperous and look good on Sunday going to Mass. Or if you to go and visit your doctor, or you to visit go and visit the priest, a suit. And the other one, of course, was for a funeral. The family had to be outfitted from maybe there might be 10, 15 or 20 members of a family who would all have to dress in black, particularly the women. And so they would all have to buy a complete outfit in black.
So you served men and women?
We did
ladies' fashion?
We did ladies and as we got gents outfitting. We also had a huge haberdashery business, which probably wouldn't be familiar with people today, and that we would have had, one must remember that at that time we sold an awful lot of cloth by the yard, and there was an awful lot of home dressmaking. So we'd have sold up the components of the home dressmaking in our shop. And when a lady wanted to, say, a new dress, she would come into us and she would choose a fabric off the shelf on a bolt of cloth, and she might have it cut down maybe to 3 yards or 1.5, and then she'd have to buy the buttons, the thread, the linings, and there was a whole business attached to that. Similarly in tailoring. Very, very few men's suits, trousers, jackets were ready-made at the time. They were made by the local tailors, and my grandfather would have had tailors in-house as well. So you had to buy the material and then it was made up according to your measurements. We also had an enormous business in blankets, sheets, curtains, blinds. The huge business then we used to call hosiery, and that would have been socks, nylons. There were no tights for ladies in those days. And so virtually the shop had a section which was devoted to a particular type of clothing. And in the men's shop we had a particular counter which was devoted entirely to shirts, ties, socks, and gloves were a big business, and underwear only. Then we had another department which was entirely devoted to suits, jackets, overcoats and outerwear, if you so to speak. And similarly with ladies.
And in your father's time, do you know of any of the staff members' names? In your, not your father, your grandfather's time?
I do. We had a man who managed, it was our manager when I was a boy. I was Mr. Willie Malloy. And he originally came to Westport from Ballinrobe. And he was apprenticed to Flanagan's, who were drapers on the top of Bridge Street, which is now a restaurant and a craft shop on the corner there. He then went to Cohen's, which was subsequently owned by the McBrides. And then he came to my grandfather when he was about 18. And he stayed with us for 62 years. And my mother, who ran the business single-handedly, simply could not have managed to run such a huge place without Mr. Malloy, or he was always Mr. Malloy. That was the other thing about that time. Everybody was either Mr., Mrs. or Miss. There were no Christian names used at that time. And it was very formal, and it was very regimented.
And your grandfather employed Mr. Malloy?
He employed Mr. Malloy, and Mr. Malloy was with us up to when my son John was a little boy, before he died. We also had a Mr. Smith who came to us from Ballina when my grandfather inherited the business from his brother who died in Ballina, and John Smith came here. And John Smith was with us until about 1964 or 65 when he retired. And he would have been working with my grandfather. We never said anybody worked for us. We always said everybody worked with us. We all worked as a team, and we were very team-like. And everybody, we all saw ourselves as a very large family, and there was a very strong ethos of that right up to the time when I retired. We all saw each other ourselves as equals, and we were only as good as the business, so we all had to pull together.
And where did your grandfather learn the skills? Did you pick them up from?
He was trained in Cooks in Turbercurry, and he would have been trained, and he would have started off at 14 years of age, and he would have been doing basically very mundane stuff at 14, and he would have been gradually broken into the working at the counters, maybe cutting cloths, learning how to make up the makings of a suit, perhaps, and then he would be involved in buying, and then he would be involved in dealing with reps, dealing with accounts, dealing with customer bills.
And there were no courses that time. You just kind of hands-on. You learned as you went along, was it?
It was hands-on. There was no such thing as doing a course.
No.
You learnt it from the floor up. It was like the old British Navy. You went in as a midshipman at 10 years of age, and you came out as Lord Nelson at the other end. There were no shortcuts.
To go back to the employees, can you remember more? Back from way back.
Well, Mr. Malloy was the one where my memory would have been with us the very longest, because remember the women all had to leave when they married.
Okay.
And so
there'd be a lot
of the men moved on. But he was the oldest and longest.
And did he work
the longest period with us?
Did Malloy and Smith work together?
Malloy and Smith worked together side by side.
Side by side.
Yeah. There's a lovely story told about Mr. Malloy. This lady arrived in Westport, who had emigrated from Westport about 1930, and she arrived back in Westport, having emigrated to Chicago, and she went into what was then Walsh's across the road from us, supermarket. Stephen Walsh's, and she spoke there to Ollie Hopkins, who was the manager there, and about how she'd left Westport 50 years, but she didn't know anybody anymore, and she found that very sad after such a long time. And Ollie said to her, "Go across the street to Shanley's, and you'll find somebody working there who was there when you left Westport." So she went across to Shanley's, and she met, when she went in the door, Mr. Malloy, and he was still there. He was a very thin man, very fit, with glasses, and he still had his full head of hair, and he hadn't changed very much. He'd aged, of course, And she went up to him. She said, "You might not know me," she said, "but I remember you." And he said, "Give me a hint." And she gave him a hint as to who her mother was. And he said, "Yes, I remember you," he said. And he said, "You came in here with your mother when you were 16 or 17. And your mother prepared you for immigration to America. And in those days, you had the American way. When you went, the chances were you never saw your children again. And the mothers of the girls, before they emigrated, would buy their daughters their wedding trousseau, so that when they got married in America, they would have their trousseau ready when they got married, and that would be their linens, their dresses, their underwear, everything." And her mother bought that girl everything in our shop. And Mr. Malloy sold her the huge old Titanic type travelling trunks with the huge big lids, and he filled her trunks in the shop, and the trunks were sealed in the shop in front of the girl and her mother. And then the trunks were sent up to the railway station in Westport, sent to Cove, and then she went along later, and she travelled by steamer to America, and she came and she remembered Mr. Malloy, and he remembered her and doing all that for her.
Right.
He had a phenomenal memory, and he was fantastic when it came to giving credit to people. He would always ask if somebody wanted to have credit from us. The first question, all the members of the staff would always go to Mr. Malloy for credit rating on certain people who didn't already have an account with us. And he would just say, "Would you please tell me," he said, "who is this lady's father and mother? Where do they live?" And he would say, "Yes, you can give them the credit," he said, "that's okay." And he said, I know the parents," he said, they're sound, decent people," he said. And then it might be another person would be run past him for clearance, and he would say, "No, the mother was no good, the father was no good, the grandparents were no good, and the odds are that this will be a black cat, black kitten. No credit."
No.
And he was usually right.
Credit controller.
Credit controller, usually right.
Yeah.
Bit like genetic testing.